This is James Anderson. I'm coming back at you with another episode of my podcast.
Music is just a word!
Welcome back to my podcast, Music is Just a Word. I'm so glad you can join me for this 5th episode. In a previous episode, I talked about how, in general, it's ironic to try to apply principles of natural selection to human behaviors. And this is for the simple reason that humans are undoubtedly intelligent designers, just like the deity against which Darwin had to define natural selection. This is an interesting and many-layered irony. Digging deeper into it will reveal some problems with the field of memetics and the concept of memes in general. So, what is intelligent design? We hear the phrase more in context of creation myths and in the arguments people make against those myths than in any context involving human beings. But, as all the different humans of all the different cultures came up with all the different gods over the course of history, in whose image did we create these gods? These creator characters that in some cases came up with all of existence in 6 days of work. It's hard to imagine any disagreement on this issue. It's we ourselves. Human beings are the intelligent designers. Humans are the real-life creators in whose image people came up with creation myths in their many forms. Apart from the handful of other animals that can come up with a handful of creative things, humans are unique in all of the observable universe in that we can intelligently design things. Here's a comment from philosopher and memeticist Daniel Dennett.
Intelligent design of the human sort now exists. We have lots of intelligent designers around, and it's becoming ever more intelligent.
Humans design so many things, and some of the things that we design end up changing the world forever. Also, the rich world of biological design that preceded us and gave rise to us is largely open to redesign. Humans have the power to reshape entire ecosystems as well as edit the very genes of organisms with tools like CRISPR. Of course, we haven't always had such godlike abilities, and the Earth hasn't always had us. It's taken a very long time for natural selection to produce such a creature with such abilities. But after 3.5 billion years of biological evolution, we, the intelligent designers, have arrived. I could see potential confusion around the concept of design, since the word design can apply not only to deliberate human designs, like a painting or a clothing garment or a pickup truck, but also to things designed by natural selection over the course of evolutionary time. Discussing the design of a thing doesn't necessarily imply that there was a designer. It's totally fair game to talk about the design of the palm tree or some strain of fungus or bacteria. These things all have a design to them, even though there was never any consciousness or purpose or foresight or intelligence responsible for coming up with that design. We can and should discuss the design process that is natural selection, and we should also discuss the evolutionary processes that entail intelligent design. If either of those things strike you as sounding kind of strange, it might be because in recent history we've seen evolution, or natural selection, pitted against intelligent design like an opponent, as in the case of debates over human origins. Mind you, that's a different kind of intelligent design than what I'm going to get into. That's a supernatural version of intelligent design. And there might be elements of creation mythology that many of us would be happy to put behind us. But human intelligent design is a very real thing. Memetics emphasizes human copying as an analog or equivalent to biological copying, like organisms and cells reproducing. So the quintessential cases when Darwinian principles can explain human behavior, at least through the memetic lens, are in those moments when people simply copy each other's behaviors. And I would say moments like these take up a fairly large percentage of our lives. Human society is so complex and so demanding, A person could never invent from scratch all the behaviors and technologies and cultural items that a human needs, even just to get through a day. Imitation is such an important and unavoidable part of any human's life, whether as an infant or at any age. So there is indeed a replication process, a non-genetic copying process, which, when combined with the variation and the selection factors, produces complex cultural design without anyone's needing to sit down and deliberately design all of it. This is universal Darwinism in a nutshell, and it suffices perfectly to explain people's actions when they are infants, or when people are just reacting, and just being impulsive, and just blindly imitating others. But when people are not just copying, when it's more than just monkey see, monkey do, when people are paying attention, when people are being mindful, when people are using foresight to anticipate the consequences of actions, this is when the familiar mechanics of natural selection have to play out in a limited or divided way. And to whatever extent natural selection might be at play among cultural elements as a human makes decisions, and to whatever extent you can use Darwinian principles to explain a person's behavior after it's happened, there is nothing in evolutionary theory or in any branch of human thought, science or otherwise, that will allow us to predict what a person will do next, especially if that person is exposed to the predictions. I've heard the memeticist Susan Blackmore on occasion use the phrase memetic selection, and here I have to clear something up. To describe selection as memetic may indicate what is being selected or not selected, memes, but this does nothing to describe who or what is doing the selecting. As much as memetics requires us to see special units of replicating information being differentially selected and rejected, the selection process is one of two familiar, unsurprising types. It's either willful humans doing the selecting, or it's selection in our absence or ignorance. Of course, you'll remember that with the theory of natural selection, the selection that nature is doing is really just the end result of all kinds of processes, and really just a matter of organisms surviving long enough to be able to reproduce. We see a surviving, reproducing organism and we say, oh, that organism was selected, but there's really nothing doing the selecting, other than maybe the organism itself by managing to not die. What the theory of natural selection really accomplishes is to show the dazzling complexity that can arise over immense periods of time without needing to invent any previously existing complexities or miracles or divine creators, and in the complete absence of purpose, foresight, intention, intelligence, and all these hallmarks of human creation. So a theory where we're trying to use natural selection to explain the cultural things that obviously result from human intentional selection would seem to be either a contradiction in terms or maybe just redundant. But we should keep in mind that it's often just a matter of perspective whether something results from an intention or purpose, or whether it results from nature or accident in the absence of intention and purpose. Natural design, more or less by definition, is what's happening outside of this realm of human or humanoid intention and awareness. I mean, that's just what the word natural means. It basically serves as an antonym or opposite to a word like intention.
Bull butter. I've seen enough damage in my time to know when it's intentional and know when it's natural.
Taking the word natural in this way and using it to characterize events that are outside of human purpose and design, we can use different possible routes to reach this outer realm. We can ascend or descend to levels where our awareness and our intentions do not make a difference. With the designs of life and organisms, evolution falls outside this realm because of the longer and older time frame, life being much older than humans. We can also, on familiar scales, observe the cracks in between humans' use of intention and purpose and intelligence. For example, we can observe when people's rationale for acting a certain way does not go beyond simple copying. The natural realm also provides a perspective for looking at culture and technology not as the results of singular, all-comprehending champions of invention, but rather emphasizing the contributions of the people who worked on the prequels to these arts and technologies. Memetics reminds us that the tools by which humanity rules the earth are the results of long evolutionary trajectories, involving many, many smaller and more cumulative contributions. We can try to use natural selection to explain a certain human choice, maybe involving little evolutionary microcosms happening inside our heads and in the airwaves as we talk to each other. Maybe when a human designs something, the design elements undergo a virtual evolutionary competition, with their corresponding symbols and thought patterns competing within the human creator's mind. We might find isolated pockets of familiar evolutionary dynamics, and these pockets may get overhauled suddenly and completely when human intelligent design and decision-making are at play. If we focus on design elements as though they were competing biology style in the absence of an overall designer, we might see individual elements suddenly rising to dominance with no warning at all. And we might ask, what just happened? What is this sudden increase in such and such corresponding with? And of course the answer is, it corresponds with a person making a decision. A person has acted according to their intentions. In a Daniel Dennett lecture I found on the internet entitled Information, Evolution, and Intelligent Design, Dennett compares the human design process with some of the designs that can be found in nature. And this is actually where the illustration comes from that's on the cover of this podcast.
On the left, we see a termite castle, an Australian termite castle. On the right, we see Gaudi's famous Sagrada Familia church in Barcelona. They are remarkably similar in shape and in construction, even inside. And yet, I propose, they are built and designed by profoundly different processes.
All kinds of creatures come up with impressive architecture, from termites to ants, bees, spiders, beavers, and of course, human beings. But in contrast to humans, all those other animal builders I just mentioned come up with their structures in a way that is inflexibly and inescapably programmed into their very genes, their very DNA.
The one on the left is built by termites who are, I hope I don't offend any termite lovers here, pretty clueless.
Ants build anthills because their ancestors built hills. Spiders make their living spinning webs because the spiders that couldn't figure out web spinning have died out over time. Beavers build their dams and their lodges in a way that they can't really choose not to do. And if a beaver did suddenly decide to stop chewing down trees, it could end up being fatal for the beaver since beaver teeth never stop growing. The Australian termites building their impressive termite cathedral are doing so cluelessly, as Dennett describes, and are doing so in a way that is unmediated by any kind of central plan, any kind of vision or foresight, or any concept of the future whatsoever. They're doing so without any records of castles made by previous termite colonies, and a termite colony can't suddenly revise its architecture and decide to adopt a new castle design. Since the termite castle evolves alongside the termite bodies, it would take a whole different colony to come up with a different design of castle. As much as the castle contains the termites, in a sense, the termites also contain the castle, since it arises pretty much inescapably from the termites just being themselves. For all the competence that these animal builders exhibit, there is little or no comprehension.
They don't know what they're doing. They don't know why they're doing it. There is no architect termite or boss. There's a queen termite, but she's not really the boss. They're just mindlessly, cluelessly, uncomprehendingly doing their little thing, and this amazing castle arises.
To put this in terms of the familiar nature versus nurture debates regarding how human children adopt a certain behavior, the termites' building behaviors are entirely on the nature end of the spectrum. The castles have an impressive design, no doubt, but in the design process, these termites are displaying little more intelligence than a peanut butter sandwich.
Gaudi, on the other hand, is almost a comic caricature of the creative genius, the megalomaniac, big boss, lording it over everybody, publishing manifestos, raising money with very grandiose gestures and all the rest. So you couldn't have a better contrast between Gaudi, the top-down intelligent designer, the genius, and the termites, the clueless, bottom-up builders.
Most of the time we hear this bottom-up and top-down language, it tends to be in the context of human organizations, companies, nations, economic systems, and so on. Dennett uses the top-down and bottom-up language to compare the opposite ways that a creature can design a grand castle. The slow, clueless evolution of the termite castle versus the deliberate, intentional designing of a cathedral by a master architect. In Dennett's case, the bottom-up picture is describing evolution, and the top-down picture is describing human intelligent design. You can also talk about the top-level processes happening in a brain or a computer, such as the complex or abstract levels of language and ideas, and you can contrast this against the bottom level of information happening in either one of these systems, a bottom level of clueless neural networks and synapses, or else the simpler hexadecimal or binary language happening at the bottom level of the computer. When I introduced top-down and bottom-up language in episode 2, it was concerning evolutionary systems and the hierarchy of life. In my case, when I said the bottom level, I was simply referring to the small levels of biological organization, like individual organisms and genes, and when I said the top level, I was referring to the larger biological levels, like entire species and ecosystems. So even though the top-down, bottom-up language can apply to many different things, there are some common themes at work, and one of those themes is that you typically have a big bottom layer of many scattered smaller elements or players, and it pyramids up until you get to the little bitty top level of a few bigger elements or players. And whether in the case of a big architectural project, or in the case of a company or an economy, this top level of fewer and larger elements is typically more unified or centralized than the more scattered and more pervasive bottom layer. The thought of having a single intelligence responsible for having created the whole universe is kind of just the hyperbole or else the extreme end of the spectrum of human influence. The all-creating, all-knowing, all-governing God is an exaggeration of a person who has attained a position of great influence, whether in the context of government and ruling, or perhaps in the context of the top creative positions, the directors and visionaries and successful artists. So basically, this has all been to say that we don't need to get into the supernatural realm to have good examples of top-down designers. But we don't have to get into the insect realm to see good examples of bottom-up design. Human culture alone covers the whole spectrum. Often in human society, there are some humans playing the role of the clueless termite builders, and other humans playing the role of the intelligent designer. And of course, these structures of influence can be highly multi-directional and overlapping. A person might be very creative and influential in some circles, while at the same time playing the unwitting termite in the grand plans or schemes of another person or group of people. In human society, when we say something is top-down or bottom-up, there's a strong implication that what we're really talking about is the many as opposed to the few. Top-down meaning the few are influencing the many, bottom-up meaning the many are influencing the few. So as society evolves and transforms, it can be a bottom-up transformation, basically synonymous with saying the word grassroots, or change can start with the top level of a few powerful people and then trickle down into the masses. In a bottom-up or grassroots scenario, you would see a behavior spread through the population more or less naturally without the help of any really deliberate, articulated, centralized motives. And then eventually the big businesses and the governments catch wind of what's going on, and the behavior reaches the top and gets reflected in the top-level structures, the policies and the actions of the influential few. By contrast, when society transforms in a top-down way, it's those influential few people in their top government and market positions arranging for changes in the behaviors of the masses, whether it's by the government introducing new policy, or the owners of a company are deciding that their employees should work different hours. Another great example of top-down transformation would be something like the Phoebus cartel. This was a group of top light bulb manufacturers who in 1924 held a meeting in Geneva to try to figure out a way to limit the lifespan of light bulbs. Before this convention took place, light bulbs could last for maybe more than 100 years. And of course, this isn't very conducive to profits if you're a light bulb manufacturer. So the Phoebus cartel, other than being the perfect example of an actual literal conspiracy, is also the perfect example of top-down transformation in society, and a top-down design process in which just one meeting involving just 4 representatives of the light bulb industry would transform this particular technology for the whole entire world.
Music is just a word.
I opened this podcast series in talking about how music is sick and dying and in danger, reiterating a point that Victor Wooten has made in his 2 novels. Looking into what kind of danger music is in, we could classify threats to music along this same top-down, bottom-up spectrum. A deliberate, purposeful plot to eradicate music, whether carried out by a visible government or else by conspirators operating in the shadows, would constitute more of a top-down threat, and an example of purposeful, intelligent design. And I made the case that while you might be able to find some deliberate plots and conspiracies against music in some parts of the world, the real danger that music is in is as much accidental and evolutionary, and just as well understood in a bottom-up way. Really though, as I'll discuss in a few moments, I think that the wide array of communications that are acting upon music in their extrinsic ways, and sometimes competing with music, are actually a combination of top-down and bottom-up processes. And whether music is being threatened by something purposeful or accidental is most often just a difference in perspective.
Let me teach you something.
Steven Pinker has a lecture on the internet where he talks about the bottom-up as well as the top-down design processes responsible for shaping the French language.
The French Academy has 2 main tasks. It compiles a dictionary of official French. They're now working on their 9th edition, which they began in 1930, and they've reached the letter P. They also legislate on correct usage, such as the proper term for what the French call email, which ought to be courriel. The World Wide Web, the French are told, ought to be referred to as le toile d'araignée mondiale, the global spider web, recommendations that the French gaily ignore.
Pinker criticizes the notion that a language could be designed in this top-down way, starting with a centralized academy, and then having a population of French speakers actually be influenced in this way and follow the directives that are handed down from the top.
This is one model of how language comes to be, namely it's legislated by an academy, but anyone who looks at language realizes that this is a rather silly conceit, that language rather emerges from human minds interacting from one another. And this is visible in the unstoppable change in language, the fact that by the time the Academy finishes their dictionary, it will already be well out of date. We see it in the constant appearance of slang and jargon, of historical change in languages, in divergence of dialects, and in the formation of new languages.
Pinker is rightfully skeptical that people could design language in the legislative or academic way. Only a very small percentage of language is the result of people's deliberate engineering. The word meme is exactly one of these rare examples. Richard Dawkins had a new idea, and so he needed a new word to express it. And so the word meme was born out of the brain of an individual human. But words arising in this manner is definitely the exception and not the rule.
Not one word in 10,000 in our vocabulary is a coined word. Most of the words have no authors, no creators at all. They are products of cultural evolution.
So the design of languages tends to result from bottom-up or grassroots processes. However, in contrast to this, in contrast to how the vast majority of language is evolving independently of anybody's intention or foresight or purpose, language seems to be the primary instrument of all these things. Language is the medium through which we intelligently design each other's lives. Intelligent design is clearly at play when you have one person speaking and the language is prompting the actions and efforts of other people. In contrast to how the design of language itself is subject to this clueless bottom-up algorithm that is natural selection, language is what gives us those top-down powers of intelligent design and influence over each other's activities. We might not always be dealing with the same completely godlike intelligent design that seems to characterize the phrase. Other than directors and creatives and rulers who are in total control, design efforts are usually happening in many directions at once. Humans' design efforts are often purposeful, foresighted, and intelligent, but when they are so mixed up and overlapping, really amounting to design by committee, it seems like a bit of a stretch for these cases to even use the word design. Seems a bit better to use the word influence. Some other familiar examples of intelligent design in human affairs would be things like policy and leadership and government. In episode 4, I introduced the idea that language is that one category of human behavior that could come to contain all behavior in a way within its catalog of nameable actions. The main purpose of episode 4 was to point out how language is playing a strong and unprecedented role in the observation of human behavior. But there's a whole other side to it that I'm only just getting into now. By being the group of behaviors to describe all behavior, language is also the group of behaviors to prescribe all behavior. Language communications dominate the evolutionary pool, not only by having superior capabilities in the observation of all the communications, but also in the deciding and the influencing of all the communications. In human society, language is a key instrument of intentionality, and when we subject others to our intentionality, this can take many different forms, but language has come to be one of the more prominent ones. Language in human society is very much a means of intelligent design. And whenever there's top-down design in society, with few people influencing many people, language always seems to be heavily involved. In this whole podcast series, I'm working under the assumption that if we're a talkative species now, that had to eventually descend from a non-talking species if you were to go back far enough, it means quite plainly and simply that our involvement with language as a species is not static or established. It's dynamic and changing and increasing. And as we've gradually increased our use of language, as language spreads to fill up every moment of a person's life, there's a corresponding increase in the range of things that a person is able to symbolize with words. And I propose that we need to be wary of this, especially since so many of the things that can now be named and identified with language are the activities of our fellow humans. Keeping in mind how young language probably is in the grand scheme of things, it's reasonable to assume that the range of phenomena and experience that can reliably be described, with any semblance of objectivity, is different from one era to the next, and might even be different from one stage of an individual's lifetime to the next. It's also reasonable to suppose that the range of human behavior that can be described and prescribed and otherwise influenced by language similarly changes from era to era. Elements of language come and go, but it's clear that the broad pattern is for language to permeate into ever newer spaces of knowledge and influence, thereby expanding language's own symbolic model of reality over more and more of reality. The overall net that we cast with language and symbolism grows to encompass more and more. With the agricultural revolution and peoples becoming increasingly sedentary, language can begin to accumulate in physical materials such as ceramics, books, and eventually computers. With the development of disciplines and specialties, knowledge and language can reach fine grains of understanding. The language involved with politics permeates and spreads until everybody's every action is everybody else's business. As history progresses, we are subjecting more and more of our own behaviors, as well as the behaviors of others, to symbolic analysis. People are subjecting ever more detailed, ever more far-reaching swaths of behaviors to language and symbols. As we watch cultural evolution play out, we are of course going to want to keep an eye out for runaway evolutionary trajectories. Arms races are a prime example. Language itself is another prime example, although a much more general one, and one that we can't disentangle ourselves from. In this strange modern era that we find ourselves living in, what's really threatening to evolve out of our control? What's really threatening to sweep over the face of the planet and turn everyone's life into something cruel and alien and unfamiliar? We're so accustomed in our culture to hearing about intelligent design and evolution as opposing candidates. even perhaps opposites or mutually exclusive things. It may sound bizarre to consider that it's intelligent design itself that is evolving out of our control. With the invasion of language, the top-down nature of intelligent design is spreading and permeating in rather a bottom-up way, rather a grassroots way.
Cultural evolution over thousands of years, but not millions, only thousands of years, has moved from very Darwinian to very intelligent design. We are now living in the age of intelligent design of culture. So we want to look at this de-Darwinizing of cultural evolution from the first beginnings of, for instance, language.
So with language, we have a real interplay between bottom-up and top-down processes. With language becoming all the more common in the overall evolutionary pool of human communications, what seems to be happening is that human intelligent design is evolving out of our own control in quite a natural way. Consequently, some of the characteristics of human intelligent design, like subjectivity and the fact of people's being able to design different and diverging things, some of these attributes are taking over as well. Could we end up designing entirely different worlds and lives for ourselves that have absolutely no correspondence? Could we keep reinventing and redesigning our culture and societies until things just get so fragmented, so polarized, and so privatized that there remains no public sphere anymore, no commons, and no gatherings outside of people's independent, subjective events and projects and businesses? This is the fate that I think we face in a world where language communications are absorbing and replacing all the other kinds of communications. The more numerous language and symbols become in the overall evolutionary pool of communications, the less we seem to be able to rely on the pre-existing designs given to us by nature and by accident. The more language and other human abilities advance, the more items we are able to bring outside of the realm of accident and nature and inevitability and into the realm of human purpose and human intention, and things entering this realm are often changed as a result of being subjected to human will. You can look at this on a planetary scale and consider how since the beginning of the agricultural revolution, humans plus our pets and livestock have gone from making up just 0.1% of the total vertebrate biomass on land to making up 98% of the total vertebrate biomass on land, all in just 10,000 years. This is known as the McCready explosion, and it's a perfect illustration of how bringing the world's food supply within the powers and intentions of just one species, humans, has led swiftly and apparently automatically to that one species takeover of the whole planet, and consequently many other species' relegation to the margins, and in many cases extinction. Other than intelligent design on a planetary scale, though, we can also focus on much finer scales of magnitude for those moments when we bring smaller things into the realm of intelligent design. We can bring something as simple as a behavioral pattern within the realm of human comprehension and control. This is often as simple as noticing the behavior and commenting on it. Human behaviors and communications can replicate or fail to replicate, depending on whether they are consciously and intentionally understood, and depending on whether the pattern is reflected in the sphere of words and language. Consciousness, comprehension, intelligent design, and intention, these things might not always be synonymous with words and language, but language is usually a pretty good litmus test or indicator for someone's being aware of something. If a person can articulate something, it means they've noticed it, which means that they can make an informed decision about where they stand in relation to this thing. And if this thing happens to be something within the person's influence and control, like a behavior or communication, then their being able to name it and comment on it is a pretty good indication of their having at least partial powers of intelligent design over the thing. Whether or not you're familiar with memetics through Dawkins' work or otherwise, or if you're only familiar with memes as the funny internet pictures, either way, I think you'll know that when it comes to memes, there's a very strong and important language component. It's the language that makes or breaks just about any meme, both in the sense of classic memetics and in the sense of the modern-day pigeonholing of memes on the internet. With the funny internet pictures, the caption is always a very central part of it. with the dance moves that go viral. There always seems to be a catchy title or concept about it. Think of the viral dance move flossing if we didn't have a name for it. Wouldn't really be the same thing. After Dawkins published The Selfish Gene in '76, memes became a popular concept. In the legacy and the popular reception of memetics, the best and clearest demonstrations of memes were the behaviors and cultural expressions that could be paired with a catchy description. The descriptions, qualifications, and identifications were as important to a behavior's meme status as the behavioral pattern itself. As memetic theory gained popularity, the chains of cultural copying that could be easily or cleverly identified ended up as the prominent examples of memes. But now that we've been discussing the history of memetics and evolutionary theory in general, it should be pretty clear that there are behaviors and patterns of behavior that replicate without there being a word, or catchy description, or similar representations. Some behaviors and patterns replicate without us even having any awareness at all. Behaviors we imitate without naming and understanding. And it's these behaviors that we imitate without the awareness that are subject to the most design-independent evolutionary dynamics. It's our unconscious copying, the copying that we do instinctively, constantly, and automatically, that make us the meme-propagating machines that Susan Blackmore describes. If memetics is really an extension of Darwinism, then we as intelligent designers ought to be focusing on the behaviors that replicate while avoiding our attention, the behaviors that we copy and pass along unexamined, unidentified, and unnoticed. Of course, they do cease to be unnoticed once we start focusing on them as memeticists. In the first episode, when I was discussing the ambiguity of memes, I noted that there's a difference between something that makes a good meme because it's an effective cultural replicator and something that makes a good meme because it's a good demonstration for people of what a meme is and of what memetics is and evolutionary theory. Now, this is a very important ambiguity to point out because the more fame a cultural item gains by virtue of being qualified as a meme, the more it enters human awareness, thereby ceasing to be acted upon by natural selection, and the more the selection process becomes intentional and within the realm of human intelligent design. The things that have made good memes in the sense of classic memetics have always been the conspicuous behaviors, unmistakable behaviors that could become known as a thing or a fad and could spread to popularity while supporting Dawkins' message and proving the theory. Things that could easily or cleverly be identified or represented in the unique medium of language were the things that got identified as memes. But remember, natural selection is, by definition, the selection process happening in the absence of an intelligent or intentional awareness, or top-level designer. The more qualified a behavior becomes for meme status, and the better it demonstrates memetic theory, the more conscious people become of it, meaning that the more it propagates with the help of its corresponding references and representations, mostly in the form of language. Meanwhile, the less it propagates through the unconscious copying that once qualified it for comparisons with natural selection. And as a meme gains fame in this way, the less it is subject to natural selection. Natural here meaning accidental and purposeless. So this is the second layer of irony with memetics. The irony that anything you identify and popularize as a meme thereby ceases to truly be a meme. So I hope that by now we can see that there's a very important difference between something qualifying as a meme because it's a good, effective replicator, and something that's a good meme because it makes a good demonstration of Darwinian dynamics in culture, something that lends itself to people's comprehension of cultural copying, replication, and natural selection. A good meme could be either one of those two things, and through the history of memetics, the word meme has effectively mutated from unconsciously replicating entities to consciously replicating entities, and this mutation has largely been able to slip under the radar. Partly, I think we've had this ambiguity because more often than not, something's a good meme in both senses. It's a good replicator, and it uses a popular and catchy name or representation to gain fame and enter our consciousness. But there are some cases where a behavioral pattern gets identified and it's the end of it. Particularly in intentional cases where people are naming it and talking about it, popularizing it in an exact effort to end the behavior. If memetics ever had a fatal flaw, it would be this lack of distinction between patterns replicating outside of our comprehension and awareness and language, and patterns happening within our awareness, as demonstrated by our having a name for them. Another thing that I think could have been different about memetics are the aspirations of scientific status. At its core, I think memetics has always been a project of influence and invention, more than investigation or inquiry. The point I'm trying to make here is that inquiry into human behavior and human culture is ultimately not really inquiry, not in any kind of passive or impartial sense anyways. Anyone who comes up with a theory of culture is bound to be operating within some kind of scale of acceptance and rejection. I think there's an inherently influential quality about any investigation into human behavior and human culture. I think it's very unlikely that someone would put forth a theory that didn't have some aspect, whether implicit or explicit, of seeking to change and influence the cultural attributes in question. Not that nobody ever makes a completely passive, completely impartial investigation into human affairs, but I think much more common are the cultural theorists who infuse a bit of their own intention into the study. This is definitely the case with the anti-theistic rhetoric in classic memetics, the treatment of religions as viruses, and so on, and it's definitely the case with myself infusing intention into the study as I gradually present my visions for music culture and the music industry. I think science isn't really the best umbrella to put memetics under. Sciences are really the pursuits of the deduction or elimination of possibility, disqualifying untrue statements until you finally arrive at a condensed piece of knowledge that has been ridded as much as possible of falsity and uncertainty and can serve as the basis for future predictions. None of this is really the case with memetics. Any knowledge we arrive at regarding memes, depending on how we interpret and share the knowledge, has the very real possibility of changing and influencing the subject matter. Human culture is at its core a generative thing. People seem just as keen to explore new patterns of behavior as they are to replicate existing patterns of behavior. So studying culture through the lens of science, a domain of disqualification and elimination of possibility, doesn't actually make all that much sense. In the way of science, we might try to rule out possibilities, just to see these possibilities spring up again because people can react to our findings how they wish. Just like culture in general, the findings of a cultural theorist will be inherently generative, whether the results being generated are in compliance or defiance to the theory. With the subject matter of the hard sciences being largely the natural world, we can make investigations that are passive and carry no attempts to modify the subject matter. Investigations aren't always perfectly passive. Even in physics, there's a thing called the observer effect, where attempts to measure something can affect the thing being measured and thereby throw off the measurement. But in a field like memetics, with the subject matter being people and culture, we can expect the observer effect to be extreme and constant, especially when a theory becomes popular and spreads virally. Running science on people often depends on their ignorance, for example with blind and double-blind experiments, and it simply isn't practical to keep people ignorant about a theory that has had viral success like memetics. In the chapter about memes in The Selfish Gene, Dawkins discusses how certain mispronunciations in the lyrics of music can spread through the meme pool thanks to having better survival value than their counterparts in the form of the correct lyrics.
Although almost everybody is singing for Auld Lang Syne, the hiss of an S and the cut of a K force their way into the child's ears, and when the refrain comes round again, he too sings for the sake of Auld Lang Syne. The mutant meme has taken over another vehicle.
to bring home the point of how investigations of culture and behavior are really more acts of creation and generation and influence, I'd like to point our attention to what Dawkins gets into next, his idea of experimentally changing the pronunciations of lyrics.
It should be possible to inject the hissing meme deliberately into the meme pool at a very low frequency, and then watch it spread because of its own survival value. What if just a few of us were to start singing, "God saves our gracious Queen"?
Now, I think it's clear that Dawkins is being just a little bit cheeky here, but just imagine the sensation and the hilarity if reports started emerging from Oxford University that Richard Dawkins himself has been experimentally mispronouncing parts of the national anthem. I can hardly think of a better source of a potentially viral meme that would attract people's attention and bring all the associated behavior replication within the jurisdiction of people's conscious choice. And from here, whether people begin copying these experimentally added syllables or whether they go on singing the songs as usual seems like a pretty trivial difference. With all of the attention that something like this could attract, any of the pattern's successes or failures are no longer being determined by natural selection. It's deliberate human selection, all the more so because of the idea being well known, and people's consequently being able to make informed, intentional decisions. Analysis of culture and human behaviors brings people into the know. By attracting people's attention to certain patterns, especially if done in an interesting or entertaining way, we are moving these patterns from the natural, purposeless realm where life began and into the jurisdiction of human intelligent design. So I think that we should run with this and study cultural evolution in a way that encourages the changes that we want to see in the world. God saves the Queen. Thanks for tuning in to Music is Just a Word. I'm looking forward to you joining me for episode 6.